Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I'm so excited to be here today with author Chad Dundas. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Truly my pleasure. Thanks for being here. And we're so delighted to be here in the bookstore Fact and Fiction in Missoula, Montana. So big shout out to them for having us. A little bit about Chad Dundas. He received his MFA from the University of Montana, and his short fiction has appeared in the Beloit Fiction Journal, Sycamore Review, Sou'wester, and Thuglit. His first novel, Champion of the World, was just released in paperback in 2019, and his second book, The Blaze, which I have right here in my hands, was just published this January. So let's start with this beautiful book. We'll make sure that folks can see it. It's so great. Tell me about The Blaze.
So The Blaze is a contemporary mystery and thriller set largely in my hometown of Missoula, Montana, where we are right now. And it tells the story of a soldier named Matthew Rose, who comes back from the war in Iraq, having suffered a traumatic brain injury due to an IED attack near the end of his tour of duty. So he comes back to the States, faced not only with reintegrating into civilian life, but also with the problem of trying to have to recover his own memories. He's had a lot of his biographical memories wiped away. And so he needs to sort of figure out who he is, where he came from, and kind of figure out his own life story. And while he's in the middle of doing that, he gets word that his father, who was a poet of some renown in Montana, has committed suicide. So Matthew travels back to his hometown in Montana to become the executor of his dad's estate and try to put his dad's affairs in order. And while he's doing that, he stumbles upon a mysterious house fire where a young university student is killed. And so that fire kind of forms the crux of the contemporary mystery in The Blaze. But it's a story about memory. It's a story about this guy trying to figure out his own personal life story while also getting pulled into this murder mystery.
Oh, fascinating. So much at play there. So many stakes. And that just happens like right from the outset too. So just gets more exciting from there. So I'd love to take a minute and you talk about your protagonist, Matthew Rose, struggling with memory loss due to his injuries. And memory is such an interesting thing because even those of us who haven't suffered a traumatic brain injury, as science tells us, the more we remember common memories, the more they're subject to, kind of being tweaked, they change over time, and that's just without a brain injury.
Right.
So talk to me. I'd love to just hear how you played with memory, both with the protagonist who has had that injury and also how that played with other characters in the book.
I think I've been thinking about the idea of writing a story about a character that suffered from some kind of amnesia for a while now. Not that that's a totally unique idea. Obviously, there are other books and movies that center around characters that have that kind of memory loss. But I was kind of drawn to the idea of setting a character like that at the center of a mystery, frankly, because of what you just said, like the ability that it would give me as a writer to kind of play with the nature of truth and play with the nature of memory, because Matthew is a guy who, as I said, has lost much of his biographical memory, and so he is very much experiencing things moment to moment, almost to the extent that it's sort of like left turn, right turn. What he's seeing kind of like on a very superficial level, taking things in. And he's put in this vulnerable position of going back to his hometown and encountering all of these people that know him from the past.
Sure.
And remember all of these experiences that he has had that he can't access. So he is constantly in the process of trying to figure out who is telling him the truth and who is maybe kind of trying to lead him astray, who is a true friend and who is not a true friend. And so as a writer, especially as a mystery writer, I found all of that very fascinating just as a setup for a mystery. So I did try to delve into that in The Blaze as much as I could.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting thing, especially in this era of the unreliable narrator.
Sure, yeah.
So Matthew Rose is doing that with literally everyone in his hometown as he comes back. Like, oh, do I trust what my third grade teacher says I, was as a student, or was she really just saying something else? It's like a very hypothetical example. So that's a really fascinating play.
Yeah, and when I started writing the book, the reliable narrator was having a real moment in fiction. The Gone Girl movie had just come out, and so there were a lot of unreliable narrators, especially in like mystery and thriller fiction. And so I did play with that a little bit. I think you're kind of, as the reader, I hope, as you go along in the book, kind of trying to figure out, is Matthew Rose a reliable narrator or is he unreliable? And I think he is trying to figure that out as well. So one of the things that I liked about that kind of a character was that you almost put the reader in the same position as the protagonist, because you and Matthew are experiencing it all at the same time. He's trying to figure out who he is. He's trying to solve this mystery. He's handling the twists and turns of this complicated situation at the same time that the reader is taking it in. So I hope that helps kind of amp up the tension and amp up the mystery of the story, and that the reader and the main character are kind of in the same boat.
Fascinating. Yeah, taking that journey together, which is so great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so speaking of journeys, the Blaze is set in Missoula, Montana,
Yes.
which is also where you live and your hometown. And so I would love to just hear you talk a little bit more about what it felt like to write a book knowing that your neighbors were going to read it and they were going to continue to be your neighbors.
Right.
And how did setting play, knowing that literally the folks who are your neighbors are going to read the book?
Yeah, so I made the decision to set it in Missoula, Montana, where I've lived most of my life in the present day, essentially because I thought that choice would be an easy thing to write. Like, I tried to make it easy on myself, but as it turned out, there were definitely challenges involved in that as well. There's a weird kind of pressure that comes along with writing about your hometown that I don't even know if I anticipated it before I started writing, but it does put this sort of pressure on you as a writer, because you don't want to screw that up, right? Because as you said, people that I know are going to read this. People who live in Missoula are going to read this book. And the last thing that I wanted was for them to come back to me after they read it and said, wow, you really did not capture the town at all.
Right.
So I did my best to kind of make the book atmospheric and to try to capture the feeling of Missoula, the feeling of the New West, really, the West that I've grown up in my entire life, which is somewhat different than the sepia-toned kind of maybe idealized view of the West that we've gotten from some past, movies, particularly, maybe some past books as well. And so I wanted to try to capture all of that in the Blaze while still making it seem somewhat true to the real feeling of Missoula. The other thing I did was played a little bit fast and loose with the geography of the town at times. So while it's set in Missoula, it's kind of a fictionalized version. I had to move some things around. I had to change a couple of neighborhoods to make sure that they would just fit the mechanics of the plot. So I hope people will give me that license and understand that I did change some things about the town. And the other thing that I found out as I began to write it is that some of this book is set on the north side of Missoula, which is the neighborhood where I live right now with my family, which again adds this sort of pressure. And it also, in a surprising way, made me feel like maybe I'm not all that observant as I tear around in my everyday life through all of this scenery that I see every day. Because sometimes when I sat down to write the book, I had to be like, what does that look like? What does that scene that's literally 2 blocks from my house look like? So
Sure.
but it was okay because I could get up and I would leave the house and go out and kind of wander around the place that I was writing about, take some notes and come back and then have a clearer picture in my mind. But it is strange that you're almost so familiar with it that you don't take it in every day as you see it.
Yeah. Oh, super, super helpful. And it is great to be able to just do that quick research. Let me just go to the corner,
Yeah.
see what that actually looks like. And to your point too about having some things that you took license with in terms of fictionalization. Well, certainly if you're burning down houses in your book, I'm really grateful that it's a fictionalized house
Yeah.
that burned down for sure.
Yeah, and every time I give it to someone, I'm like, I hope they don't think any of these characters are based on them.
Right.
Because they're not, but at the same
Right.
time, people in Missoula could read it and they could make certain assumptions, but
For sure.
it's fiction. It's
Yes,
all made
for
up.
the record, it is fiction. So good, so good. And so speaking of other works of fiction, your first novel, Champion of the World, just
Right.
came out in paperback. I'd love it if you could just tell me a little bit about that book and what were some of the lessons that you learned writing Champion of the World that came forward to writing The Blaze?
Sure. Yeah, Champion of the World is a historical fiction novel that is set in the early 1920s, and it takes on the world of professional wrestling and the world of traveling carnivals. It's about a married couple. The husband is a former wrestling champion who has fallen on hard times and is now working at this carnival, working as a wrestler for a carnival, and the wife is a card sharp who plays in this kind of adult-themed carnival's game room, essentially. And the crux of the book is about professional wrestling's transition from being a hard-nosed, legitimate professional sport to becoming a sort of scripted vaudeville sideshow as we know it today, and how that transition affected all of these characters in the book and all of these wrestlers who kind of prided themselves for their entire lives on being tough, hard-nosed guys who are now faced with this obstacle of having to fake it. And they inherit all of these new challenges of having to essentially be actors and work together instead of work against each other. And so it was surprising to me, I think, that my first novel was historical fiction. I thought that I was going to be more of a like mystery and thriller writer from the beginning, but Champion of the World was a little bit of a unique obsession that kind of dealt with a bunch of my childhood interests and lit up all these different nerd centers in my brain. And it was kind of a story that I got obsessed with and had to just get it out on the page so that it would leave me alone. And was published in 2016 and kind of got this writing journey started for me. But in many ways may turn out to be atypical, I guess, in terms of the kind of books that I write in the future as well. So we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just in your summary there, I'm seeing some interesting parallels that, like maybe, between the two books, right? Where, with this moment in wrestling, there's this story that's being told, right? And it's the public story, right? Is this an authentic fight or is this a scripted fight for entertainment, right? And also with this question of memory, like, is this an actual memory or is this the story I'm being told? So lots of play there between like narrative and interpretation and viewer and actor and all of that in there.
Yeah, of course. That's definitely one of the things that drew me to writing about wrestling as a fiction writer was, again, kind of playing with the nature of truth. And sometimes the people who are involved in it themselves don't know what's on the level and what is scripted, or if they're being worked by someone else who's trying to put one over on them. So that was definitely a big part of my interest there, and great fun as a fiction writer to kind of try to blur the line between nonfiction and fiction, or reality and fiction.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent. Well, must readers, please do check out Champion of the World. Also The Blaze. We'll keep just showing this beautiful book. And so my last question. So in addition to writing fiction, you are also a sports writer and a podcaster. And I also learned that you wrote the text for a graphic novel. And so I love that you dabble so widely with your writing and you really cover the gamut. And so I'm just curious to hear both what draws you to some of those other mediums and what does that bring to your fiction?
Yeah, I was always interested in journalism. I kind of had these dueling interests between journalism and fiction since I was a pretty young kid. I have a brother who's 3 years older than me. He kind of crafted this interest in journalism as a young person in me because that was sort of the path that he was walking, and I wanted to emulate him and be like him, as annoying little brothers will do. And then I was lucky enough to come from this family of writers that always had a great appreciation for fiction. My grandmother was the head librarian for the school district here in town, and so she was constantly plying us with books. So I think from a young age I got to see not only like people who were interested in the craft of writing, but also people who were doing it for a living. So I was sort of privileged to come from this background where I saw people living this lifestyle where I was like, oh, that's a thing that people can do. And so, as a student, I pursued both. I got a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Montana, and then went back later and got a master's degree in creative writing. And so I kind of always knew that I would try to do both things, try to write fiction and then do journalism as a day job or on the side, depending on how you want to look at it. And then, just in terms of casting a wide net of like doing podcasts and writing stuff for graphic novels, I think some of it is out of necessity because, as the journalism industry changed from the time that I graduated college until now, a lot of us have had to like diversify our interests and diversify our areas of work just to try to, make money essentially. So like I was freelancing for a long time as a journalist until about 6 or 7 months ago. I got my job that I currently have at The Athletic, which is a full-time thing. But, when I was freelancing, I was doing a lot of different stuff, and writing the graphic novel was one of those for about the last 8 years. A colleague of mine and I have hosted a weekly podcast. And so, it was just sort of like partially out of necessity and partially, I think, just to make things really difficult on myself because I like to have this insane schedule that's constantly going. But then to speak to your question about like how journalism and fiction work together for me, I think that they're closely related. I feel like journalism informs my fiction in a lot of different ways. I like to tell people I feel like I learned as much about writing from like working on newspapers every day as I did from like fiction workshops, just in terms of like economy of language, like clarity of voice and narrative speed, kind of like trying to keep this propulsive action going to hold the reader's interest. All of that bleeds over, I think, between the two, and it just so happens that I feel like my style of fiction writing is pretty direct and straightforward and kind of, I guess you could say, journalistic in style. So I think that the two of them are really closely related.
Oh, fantastic. Sounds great. Well, thank you for going on that journey so that we could go on this journey, The Blaze. So Mustarders, please do check out The Blaze by Chad Dundas. And thank you. Thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.